Um, except the direction I want to take now is towards a different class of questions having to do with assessing an economy. And bear in mind that this assessment could be of, for the moment I leave unexplained what an economy is. It could be a household. It could be your own household. You could be assessing how am I doing? How is my household doing? It could be a city, it could be a state. Obviously, the unit of analysis very often, at least in international discourses, is over nations. And sometimes, as was the case this morning with Roger's lecture, we were thinking of the economy as being the world as a whole and consequences to that economy arising out of actions we take. I began earlier, yesterday, I suggested to you that assessment is a very different exercise. It's an evaluative exercise, to be sure, but it's different from prescription. And yet we will find, fortunately, that the mode of analysis is very similar. And what I'll try and do this lecture is to elaborate on that. And I have some strong thoughts here to express to you, because in some ways we are much more familiar with assessment than we are of prescription, because we can't open the newspaper without being told which country is doing well, which country is doing badly, why, and so forth. And we have numbers to show for it. And these numbers are based on some indicators of the health of the economy in question. And you have every right to ask, where does that indicator come from? What does it represent? Are these indicators consistent with the ideas that we use when we think about prescription, choice of projects, for example? If they're not, then there's something troubling, or should be troubling, because you have, with your right hand, you're doing something that your left hand doesn't know, and vice versa. So assessment is not unrelated. We should know that. What do I mean by assessment? We typically have several types of questions we ask. We can ask, how are we doing now? What's the state of affairs in the economy under study? We could be asking questions like, under business as usual, what is our forecast? What is likely to be the future trajectory of the economy under the policy that are guiding us at the moment? And then typically, if we think the news is bad, the prognosis is bad, or the forecast is gloomy, then we think about turning to policy and seeing how to Oh, I see. Well, why don't I just wait? That's right. So if you look at the Human Development Report, you have very similar tables. They may lay emphasis on different objects. For instance, the World Bank would have very rich data set, 170 countries, perhaps, on growth rates of GDP and population growth rates of the past 20 years. So they'll give you time averages over the period. They'll give you data on life expectancy at birth, infant mortality rates, proportion of the population who are literate, maternal mortality rates, and so forth. These are indicators which are all trying to tell us something. And they're trying to tell us, many of these are very important indicators because they're telling us things of great importance. Life expectancy, and so forth. Okay? All of these are descriptors, and we want to know how they shape up with, relative to what we've been discussing so far. They're not the natural things for us to look at, other than GDP. I'll come back to that in a minute. Other than GDP, these don't seem the natural objects of interest in economics. Certainly the models that we look at integrals of utilities and so forth. So what's going on? What I want to do today, this afternoon, is to show you how perhaps we could amalgamate these concerns. None of these objects that are being studied are of irrelevance. They're terribly important. They're giving you pieces of the picture. But if you come at the problem from a different end, that is the end that we've been working with, which is human well-being, some notion of human well-being, and what the constituents of human well-being are, then we might be able to make a connection, and then perhaps even suggest improved indicators. You typically, whenever you have multiple indicators, you have a problem. Too many indicators and you're in trouble. You'll have to look for vectorial dominance, otherwise you start talking about trade-offs, and then you don't know what you're trading off because there are pieces of the jigsaw regarding human well-being. On the other hand, it may be too much to expect us to be able to get a scalar indicator of well-being which amalgamates these, because you need weights to do that. And the moment you do that, philosophers will come jumping at your throat saying, well, you're a crude economist if you think you can find weights that easily, and maybe they're incommensurate and so forth and so on. You can go that route and think about perhaps narrowing down the number of things that you care about, which you can easily or relatively easily measure, and then they represent what you're really after. I want to start thinking of the distinction between determinants of well-being and the constituents of well-being. By the latter constituents, I mean the objects which actually are components of that object which we call well-being. Pleasure, happiness, state of mind, length of life. The idea that you live longer rather than shorter may be part of what you regard as a person's well-being. Health, aspects of health. If you're ill, it's not going to be, it'll be rather awkward to say that the person has a high level of well-being while the person is in fact bedridden and so forth. So there will be, these are aspects which I'm going to call constituents. They are aspects of well-being, and they somehow, we are to amalgamate them into a scalar object. Then there are the determinants of well-being, and typically when we write down a utility function, let us say, and utility is a function of consumption, the distinction becomes clear. U is the constituent, that's the real, the object of interest. Consumption is just a means of that, and so it's a determinant. Philosophers and also sociologists will tell you that it's not consumption that really matters. What matters is relationships, interchanges with people, amongst people, what you do with your life, more activities. It's a sort of activity-led view of that's not going to be inconsistent with the economist viewpoint, because activities require goods. And so we could be thinking of U as a function of C as being, if you like, a reduced form of a complicated picture, translating activities through goods and then creating a link between the two. So what I will be concerned with today is to use the platform of sustainable development, the expression which has become extremely common now, perhaps even bitterly common, because you can't have a conference without the word sustainability in it, or sustainable something. I remember Avinash Dixit and I spent the afternoon discussing the ideal conference title, which will have the 5 or 6 words in it, so how to construct them into it. But this is very serious stuff. I want to show you how perhaps it's a very important notion, but it has to do with assessment. The background reading which I have circulated, which you will have in your, there are 2 papers of Arrow et al. There are 2 et al. Papers. I'm afraid the third one, I've got the title wrong. It's called Sustainability and the Measurement of Wealth. That's number 3, but that's with you. I won't really be going through these papers, but should you find this area interesting, then and you feel you would like to contribute to the area, then these could be as good a set of readings to kick off with as any. It's a subject which is likely to become extremely dominant in the national income world of national income, international comparisons. because the issues are very general, and I want to. Okay, so the sustainable development, the notion, offers a weak criterion for assessment. So let me give you the model first, and the background model. I won't write down a dynamical system, because you probably have noticed that I've avoided dynamical systems as far as possible, whenever possible, because in some sense, because of what I was asked to lecture on is the first few lectures, so I thought I'd concentrate on the welfare side of things and leave the feasible set more or less vague and appeal to some simple models when I need it, but not until then. Time is continuous, ST, and we consider a deterministic world. Of course, considerations translate so long as you have a reasonable theory of decision under uncertainty for the social evaluator, I mean. One of the things I'm particularly concerned with emphasizing in this lecture is the thought that we live in a very imperfect world, and that when people do political economy, study political economy, when political scientists discuss the state of the world with economists, those conversations, those discussions are of the utmost importance, and we should take them very seriously. There are viewpoints, for example, that the late Seymour Lipset expressed, where he said economic development, by which he, of course, at those days meant GDP growth, increase in GDP, encourages democracy. Then there is a reverse causality which has been explored by some people, like myself, some years ago, trying to see whether democracy fosters economic growth. A good political theory would have a synergistic picture of the two. They'll get it wrong, obviously. There is no such model. But people are trying at it, trying to get it, and it's very reasonable to think. And so I'm going to be spending a little bit of time on describing an imperfect world, because we want to do the assessment on imperfect worlds, just as I was suggesting that we should be doing prescription in an imperfect world as well. If we need a language, we need to master a language to be able to discuss economic evaluation, no matter how bad the world happens to be. So optimization was only one part of the piece that I discussed this morning. And yesterday, much of the time I was looking at imperfect economies. Here I'm really going to be spreading out thin, because the data suggests that many countries have been doing very badly. Perhaps you would be expecting that result, but we need a language for that. So we consider a deterministic world. Now I'm going to apologize. I'm really bad at proofreading. Sometimes vectors here are going to have a bar underneath, and sometimes that same vector will be in bold without a bar. I will alert you to that fact, okay? But both are legitimate notations, depending on which textbook you use. Somehow or the other I became schizophrenic. Okay, so there are M vector of consumption services. I want to think of consumption as a service flow. So when I incorporate Roger's model, for example, which will find expression here, the capital asset which enters into utility function will be thinking of the capital asset, which is a stock, giving a service. And it's some proportion of the capital asset, which is like the flow that enters into it. Okay, so there are M of these goods, and then there are N capital assets. And I'll be coming to the notion of capital assets in a minute. Subscript for assets is I, subscript for consumption are J. Okay, an economic forecast at any date small t is the infinite sequence CS, and now here I've got underlined bars. Okay, so these are vectors. CS, KS for S greater than or equal to T. Okay, that's a infinite sequence. That's the economic forecast at T. I want to make the notion of an economic forecast rigorous now. So here is what it, so now I've got bold. Okay, so I've warned you. Sometimes bold, sometimes underlined, but they're the same thing. So long as the object is the same, it's C. Okay. Right. So let E, the vector E of S, summarize an infinite sequence from T, denote an economic program with K, T as the initial condition. K's are stocks, C's are flows. Okay? A definition: a resource allocation mechanism, capital M, in bold, is a many-one mapping from the inherited capital assets at date T to an economic program starting from that date. That's it. Examples abound. And it's going to be useful for me to think like this because it forces us to think about playing around with imperfect economies as well as optimizing economies. Familiar example, suppose the allocation mechanism is optimum. It means that give me the k bar t at date t, and imagine that our welfare function is the integral of discounted utilities or undiscounted utilities, and it maximizes that. The society always maximizes, so the mapping will be from the initial capital stock to the entire optimum program. That mapping is the optimum resource allocation mechanism. Another would be a competitive allocation mechanism. Imagine the kind that we very often study in macroeconomics, I guess. Then again, it's the mapping from initial capital assets to an efficient, a competitive allocation mechanism. And if there are multiple equilibria, well, then you need a selection mechanism. So again, you specify the selection mechanism, selection criterion, and then you're away. For simple models, I've had some problems in the past, initially when we were discussing these matters at seminars, so perhaps I'm belaboring the obvious, but you'll pardon me for doing that. Simple example would be, of course, the standard Solow growth model. It's an imperfect economy. It's a constant savings rate, unexplained parameter. That's it. But so given the capital asset, you can track the entire consumption pattern and the capital accumulation pattern. And the mapping from the initial capital asset at T to the future will be the resource allocation mechanism. So that's all I mean. It's a resource allocation mechanism is a mapping. But embedded in it is a huge amount of political economy, because it involves institutional description. It tells us, as these examples tell us, institutions matter, and they influence the resource allocation mechanism. Of course, institutions could be thought to be evolving, and that's why my reference to Lipset and others. If it's evolving, then if you have the political theory which picks that evolution on board, then the mapping will reflect that. It'll say, for example, that as you're accumulating, institutions are changing, perhaps changing savings rates, changing and so forth. But that will be reflected in the mapping itself. You will have anticipated that at date T. Okay? So coevolution of politics, economics, is very much part and parcel of this. Right? The richer your understanding of the political economy of the system, the more precise, the more believable will the resource allocation mechanism be. But you can see where I'm heading. Now, in this world, we want to do some assessment. I said capital assets. What do I mean by them? So I'm working backwards because I know where I'm going to be heading. And I want to suggest now that we want to think about capital assets in a very rich way. So there's the usual type 1 reproducible capital assets: buildings, roads, machines, vehicles, the stuff of basic economic models. Okay? I want to include, obviously, human capital: skills, knowledge, health. Human capital, health and education have both a constituent element, health in particular, as well as a determinant of well-being. If you're in good health, you feel good. It must be a constituent. On the other hand, of course, if you feel well, you're a more productive worker than you would be if you were not feeling well. So several of these objects have both virtues, as being productive input as well as a final, as an object of intrinsic worth. Population, so there's nothing very new in what I have to say about human capital: skills, knowledge, tacit knowledge, for example. Population is an asset, the whole demographic structure, age distribution, the whole works, things that matter. I will be particularly interested here, given Roger's lecture today and my own research interest, on natural capital. We have in mind ecosystems, oil and natural gas, biomes in general, small local resources, and so forth. I'll come back to these issues as we go along. Then there is publicly available knowledge: science, mathematics, technology. that class of things, the objects out there for us to pluck, so long as we have the human capital to pluck it. It's obvious we want to include that. These days, pretty much anything which looks durable is called a capital asset. So we talk about institutional capital. We talk about a religious capital, social capital, you name it, it's a capital. Okay? Cultural capital, and so forth. I'm putting them all under the rubric of institutions. Sometimes we call it social capital. But for reasons that I will see presently, I'm going to keep publicly available knowledge and institutions separate from the first four categories. One way of thinking about the reason in advance as to why we might think of institutions as being a different style of asset. There's no harm if people want to call them capital assets, nothing wrong with that. Name is a name. But what do we do with it is up to a point a matter of convenience. So long as the convenience doesn't shatter our goals in a consistent way. We might think of institutions, which remember are embedded in our notion of resource allocation mechanism, as enabling assets. They enable, they in some sense influence the way these numbers 1 to 4 flow. And under bad resource allocation mechanism, under bad institutions, resources, the capital assets like reproducible capital will not find its right home. If you have bad institutions, e.g. Open access resource, so that the property rights are ill-defined, you have misallocation, which is another way of saying that the natural capital is being misused relative to other forms of natural capital. So I'll be thinking of institutions or social capital in general as being enabling assets. So I'll be keeping them separate, and you'll see why it becomes useful and important. I will do that similarly with science, mathematics, and technology. And the reason I want to do that is that often from macroeconomic models, the way to estimate growth in knowledge is through looking at total factor productivity growth. It's a convenient simplification, but beggars can't be choosers. So long as we know how to do it ideally, it doesn't matter very much if you cut corners like crazy when it comes to actual practice, because you know that you are cutting corners. The key thing is to know that you are cutting corners. And for that, you need good theory. And very often we then say, oh, total factor productivity growth, well, if you think that you can't explain it, it's happening exogenously, then, of course, it's like a drift term. It's taking the economy, it's like a big river, and the boat is being guided along, and the river is taking it along. And so you might want to make the judgment dependent on calendar time, because time is now becoming. On the other hand, if you have a rich theory of the production of knowledge, then of course all this is endogenous anyway. And you're back to types 1, 2, and 4 as a capital asset, because they are the ones who are generating the new theorems, the new theories, and so forth. Okay? So for these various reasons, I want to think of 1, 2, 3, and 4 as my structural basis. I'm going to call that our productive base of the economy. They are the base on which the entire economy hangs, these assets. Notice I've moved away already from thinking of flows to stocks. Okay? And you will see why and how to construct indicators of well-being, human well-being, or the economy's well-being on the basis of stocks rather than flows. And I'll give you a justification for that in a few minutes. 3 is problematic. You can already smell a problem. Because if population is a capital asset, population always poses a problem anyway. Because it's both the end of the whole exercise, and yet we feel population is a part of the determinants of well-being, other things being equal. So it has a delicate role to play. I want to move away from a world in which population is constant, obviously, because if I want to look at data, it would not do. I can tell you in advance what I will work with. I'll be working with models in which it is appropriate, reasonable. I mean, it's a theorem, so it's accurate there, where population will be used as a normalizing factor. Things will be expressed per capita terms. It's not always justifiable, by the way. It's very important to bear that in mind. But it can be done, and it helps us a lot. One of the papers that which I haven't circulated with you, that Professor Arrow co-authored, showed how difficult it would be if those conditions are not satisfied. That is to say, you then have to find shadow prices for population, and that's a very awkward thing. It requires information of a kind that we typically don't have or appeal to. I'll come back to that later. Anyway, so that's the background. That's why we're interested in the productive base. The welfare function, exactly as equation 1, it repeats here as equation 1. The only thing I've introduced here is just in case you want to see its relevance, I've introduced capital stocks directly into the utility function in the way that Roger did. But there will be flows of services to the capital stocks entered. So my U is a function of the vector of consumption goods as well as capital stocks if they matter. Obviously, oil and natural gas will not be in it, but beaches and so forth would be in it, or the wonderful terrains in Israel, they would be in it because they give you direct pleasure. But nothing is going to hang on this, by the way. It's just that to make a connection. I anticipated this, and so it's good because Roger expressed. Now,
so what distinguishes the C and the K, the services of the K?
Yeah.
You said beaches, so what?
You're right. In a way, the C, imagine, take Roger's model. He had a reproducible capital good, an all-purpose reproducible capital good, which is generating consumption. And then there's a natural capital also, like climate, I guess, or nature, or something like nature. And he had included the service flow of nature directly into the utility function. And then the issue was over the less use of substitution between that flow and material goods, serving the same purpose here. But again, if you feel that it's just a notational issue because I've got a vector of consumption goods anyway, then just delete the K's and expand my C's to include some of these K services. But you're right.
The distinction is not producible and non-producible.
No, you're absolutely right. You could have some Ks which are both means of production as well as part of, like health. You will have some Ks which are oil and natural gas, which have no virtue other than they're useful. And then they'll have some Ks which are, well, maybe they're always useful because you have to do something with it. Well, no, you just enjoy the sight. It's not producing anything, but it's there. Or it could be a shrine or a place of religious significance.
Oil and gas, you said this is not, I don't see.
They would not be part of.
These are indirect.
Yeah, they'll be the determinants. Yeah,
Of C.
yeah, that's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I enjoy gas.
No. And I don't want you to think that all the Ks. I haven't said anything about the marginal. Okay, look, but I don't think we have any. So long as you can even just ignore the K within the U. It may be misleading given the fact that I have a vector of C's, and that would cover Roger's case. The idea of sustainable development, as we currently discuss it, came in the famous Brundtland Commission report of 1987, Our Common Future. And it's a very oft-quoted passage, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And so I'm going to I'll be basing my the analysis that follows from it, on it, because it's telling me this is not about, it's not really a welfare criteria, it's just telling us a way of assessing whether an economy is doing well or not well. It's not giving us, it's not telling us prescription. So here are some comments. Sustainable development requires that relative to their populations, each generation should bequeath to its successor at least as large a productive base as it had inherited before. There are passages in it which suggest this is what they were after, but the issue is not what Brundtland Commission really was after. The issue is, what do we make? Can we make some sense of a very important document which has influenced international opinion in a very major way? I can't imagine a more influential document coming from an international body of experts. This was not a government commission. It was one which I think Brundtland was at that time Prime Minister of Norway. She was already. It was after. She was retired. She was one of the great and good, as we call it in. Yeah. So it's very, very, very influential. No, I agree. I suspect that's true. Yeah. Okay, so I'm trying to interpret it as what we leave behind for our next generation. Is the expression that we've been using so far. Now, notice in the optimization story that we've been discussing previously, we determined the optimal productive base to leave behind. Here, the demand is much less. We're just simply asking, are we leaving enough behind to meet their needs? And so, hence, the second observation, the requirement is derived from a relatively weak notion of intergenerational equity. Sustainable development demands that future generations have no less of the means to meet their needs than we do ourselves. It demands nothing more. It doesn't, for example, demand that development be optimal or just. Or you might say it's a weak notion of just. It says it shouldn't decline. Okay? Sorry? It might even contradict, indeed. If your delta is very high, then, as we know, your V would be optimal V will be declining, but and then it's inconsistent with sustainability. So I want to just work with the notion of sustainability. So the question is, how is a generation to judge whether it is leaving behind an adequate productive base for its successor? Okay? Tracking GDP or the United Nations Human Development Index won't do, and you can spot immediately why. The reason is that in GDP, the rogue word is gross. And so you could have a high GDP, but leave behind a lower productive base. In fact, the means of having a high GDP could be to mine your productive base. There are standard examples. I remember Jeff Heal and I produced some to illustrate not sustainable development, because we had never come across that notion at that time, of how GDP could mislead, but by thinking of an economy with simply oil and nothing else. And think of a world in which all they can do is to consume that exhaustible resource. Let's say it can export it and then get consumption goods and doesn't have any way of investing that. Then they could choose a program of depletion, which is increasing depletion for a period. And then, of course, eventually it has to go to zero. Goes without saying, because the integral has to be equal to the initial stock. But suppose the plan is, or the forecast is, that for the first 100 years, there'll be increasing exports, increasing consumption, and therefore increasing GDP, because there's no investment. But of course, meanwhile, of course, your stock is depleting. Now, if you were to estimate NDP, net national, then you would be getting a more secure indicator, because you would be depleting the depletion of the oil from the GDP, and your NDP will be zero. And but that too will have problems, because your stock is actually declining, but your NDP signal is that it's zero. You might say that it's no worse than we were before, but of course you're staring at a poorer country. So these examples tell you immediately that these flow indicators are likely to be misleading. Okay? And we will, at the end, I'll have the temerity to give you some numbers from some work that a few of us did some years ago. Very imperfect numbers, but they show you why GDP can mislead. Likewise with the Human Development Index. I don't know if you mess around with these objects, but the Human Development Index, which is extremely influential, is a linear index, at least up till recently it was a linear index, of GDP per capita, life expectancy, and literacy. So the idea was to pick up various features of life, things that matter. Health matters, education matters, and of course goods matter. So the GDP side was picked up, and it was normalized, but it was a linear index. And they began by using to rank countries. So they were assessing. They're saying, and then every now and then you read in the newspapers, whenever the Human Development Index is published, which is once a year, you read in the newspaper, Norway is number 1, or Finland is, basically it's a Nordic country which makes it, by the way. It's a toss-up between Finland or Norway, and Sweden gets very annoyed about that. And, they tinker around with the weights a little bit to see if they can somehow make it. And you can anticipate where the lowest scoring countries would be. They would be somewhere in Chad or and so forth. Okay, where these indicate. Now the problem with HDI does pick up some aspects of the productive base because they're picking up education and life expectancy, which you might think are, and they should be regarded as part and parcel of what we are really after. But of course, it's got GDP. But more important, again, it suffers from the same problem as not taking into account depreciation of capital assets. So you don't know whether your HDI is very high at the expense of the future. And since we are looking at sustainable development, we are asking about the future very consciously. They are likely to mislead.
No. Life expectancy, isn't that, I'm worried about the double counting. Life expectancy should be reflected as a factor in the production of other goods. And you live longer, people will work longer or produce more, or leisure, whatever it is. And if you count it separately, so
there will be some double counting, but on the other hand, no, I think you're right. You're right.
Per capita GDP, so it corrects part of it. It's per capita GDP.
But people who would have been dead are still working. That's what. That's.
Per capita is less related to life expectancy.
it might be enjoyed to some extent.
Yeah, I think that's the argument that helps.
You enjoy the consumption good.
That's a consumption good. That's it.
It is, to some extent.
As a constituent of.
Also the negative then. You suffer when you're old.
Well, for some reason,
But then Eitan's right. We'll come back to that. I won't have data on this, but some recent work that we've been doing collaboratively, in fact, since you've asked the question, we must address it. Okay. So so you live till 90 or whatever, and you worry about. So one way of thinking about it would be, there are these dailies and qualies, quality of life adjusted. Quality adjusted statistics, life years, and dailies are disability adjusted life years, and so forth. Okay, so that you would attack that question from that end.
There's a question whether if you live longer, you have more disabilities or quality of life. Not clear. It looks like it's the same number. I think the evidence is the other way around. Same number of years before you die that you suffer. It isn't you're not suffering for longer periods. Today's 70 is yesterday's 50 or something like that.
Yeah. No, I think that is incontrovertible. It's incontrovertible.
At any given age, people are more mobile and need less medical care
than they did before. We just lead healthier lives in many ways. Okay, so starting with K naught and the economic institutions, now these should be bold. Let CTKT be an economic forecast. So we define it in terms of social well-being itself. So here's my, an economic program, CTKT, displays sustainable development at T if VT increases or does not decline during that period. I'm calling it delta. So the delta VT should be read at dVdt. Okay? Now V is a stock. V is the intertemporal welfare, intergenerational welfare evaluated at date T. Okay? We are used in optimization exercises in always thinking of the initial date at T equal to 0. Here, the whole idea is to assess the economy as it moves through time. So it would be a bit misleading to use 0 as my anchor point. So I'm leaving a free variable T. So at the evaluation, assessment is made at any date T. Okay? Now, it's obvious that what I've written as V as a function of KT is the Bellman value function. but now thought defined not through an optimization exercise, but through my general resource allocation mechanism, because I have a mapping from KT to the entire future. Therefore, I can, from that knowledge of that mapping, I place that entire future into my V function, because V is a discounted value of the U's, and so my V depends on my K. So it is the Bellman value function, okay? Except that we're not maximizing necessarily. Okay, so I'm going to be using V as my numeraire, simply for neutrality purposes. Of course, national income data or data in the World Bank will typically be in terms of consumption or income expressed in dollars, but that I'm just using, nothing hangs on it. I can always renormalize it. So shadow prices, the only reason I've given it as a definition is that I don't want you to think of it as a Lagrange multiplier in the usual way, because I don't have a optimization model in mind. So my shadow prices are defined essentially as arising out of perturbations, conceptual perturbations that I can conceive of along the forecast that's implied by the resource allocation mechanism. So I have a whole bunch of shadow prices of the consumption goods. These are obvious, del U, del C's. And then I define my capital asset shadow prices at del V, del KI's. Okay? I'll need a little bit of work to show that I can do this. These are important matters. If the environment matters, if ecology matters, I would typically expect potential tipping points because of nonlinearities in the dynamical processes that are being embedded within the resource allocation mechanism. So it could be that we are in those cases where V is non-differentiable, maybe not even continuous. But as in many other cases, you can smooth that away by introducing noise, by saying, I know there is a tipping point, but I don't know where it is. So I'll be thinking of V, if you like, in expected value terms, if you wish. Okay? So these are the definitions. And a great deal of work, an enormous amount of work in environmental and resource economics has been to estimate these Q's and P's. A great deal of work on the P's has, having said that, I should say that many of this work has not been very, let me put it this way, I have not been particularly crazy about that work, and here's why. Not because there was anything wrong with them, but when I talk about an environmental resource, it can carry in your mind, it can bring to your mind the picture of an amenity, a park, a beach, a place of leisure, activity. And we want to think of this as a potentially crowdable public good. And the question is, how do we value its worth? One way could be a whole lot of methods have been developed. Hedonic prices are one. Another is the famous contingent valuation technique is another. So you look at behavior and or you ask questions, how much would you pay, and so forth. And very, very sophisticated methods have been devised, which I can't necessarily judge all that well. But the reason I'm slightly saddened by the plethora of work on this area is that it has concentrated on amenities, whereas if you mention the environment in a rural context in Africa or Asia, it will not be really amenity, it'll be the means of survival. It'll be water, it'll be, and there you don't go to a farmer household and say, by the way, how much, in a non-monetary economy, say, how much are you willing to pay to see that the well doesn't get dried up? What you do need to do, and people have now begun to do some work on this, and they're very difficult pieces of work, but extremely interesting and, in my judgment, very, very important, is actually to take with you an economist, econometrician working in conjunction with soil experts, agronomists, and so forth, to try and look at the production function, the production structure, what the what the water does to the household income flow, and so forth. Which is why I come to this slide, which is, so in order to estimate these shadow prices, we need three types of information. One is a descriptive model of the economy, e.g. the solar model or something, but it's and the descriptive model of the economy means, for our purposes, the resource allocation mechanism, an understanding of the resource allocation. It could be a village economy, by the way. So don't always think in terms of a nation. It could be that you're studying the effect of deforestation in the uplands of a watershed on the lives of villages downstream. Okay? Because deforestation in the uplands of the watershed has effects on the productivity of farmers and productivity of fishermen in the coast, in the downstream, because of water runoff, and so forth. Okay? Now, for that, if you want to see what happens if there is deforestation, because that's going to affect the value of capital downstream, and of course, it should be used, that impact should be used to value the forest upstream, which is a capital asset. Because you want to ask, remember, the question being asked is, suppose, the standard question, given the resource allocation mechanism, if God were to give an additional unit of Ki, of I, the ith capital asset, what would be the implication on V? That's what equation 4 says. So the way to do that is a roundabout set of questions you have to answer. One is, first of all, get a sense of the resource allocation mechanism. So in the case of this example that I'm mentioning, imagine that it's Malaysia or Indonesia, and there are hardwoods on the uplands. And these are exact, I'm not cooking this up. This is a genuine example. There is a huge hunger for hardwood in China, in India. They're growing like crazy. They're importing. And imagine it's all fair play. There's nothing hanky-panky here. No. So the concession is given to the forest, upland, for deforestation or timber, which will then be exported. Now, typically, the FOB price will not include the damage that is inflicted downstream, which is the point of my exercise. Therefore, if you use the FOB price as the price of timber, you would be underestimating the value of the forest in a big way, potentially in a big way. How do you correct for that externality? This is a standard problem. I mean, it's an externality problem. The question is, how do you get to that externality? How do you attack that externality quantitatively? And much of the literature, as I was suggesting, has been to think of these externalities as being coming through amenities. But I would like to suggest that some of the biggest concerns that the world has are over the production side of things. And this is one example. Okay? Now, I'll follow through that example in order to give you a hint of where I'm heading. So the CIF price, FOB price rather, we will agree. But imagine that all other things are okay. So then FOB price is an underestimate of the social price of the stock of forest at the margin because it's not including the damage inflicted downstream. Okay, which means what? Which is, if you think through this, you would immediately say, oh, well, obviously Malaysia is subsidizing China or India because it's giving away a good which at a lower price than its own loss. Which is another way of saying that it's actually transmitting or transferring some of its wealth to China or India, as the case might be. Now, the case is particularly saddened by the fact that the people who are subsidizing this are amongst the poorest people in Malaysia. They're the farmers out there. It's not coming out of some general taxation. It's an impact on their lives, right? So these are very important. These things are important. What we're discussing, this is all very theoretical. So we need a descriptive model of the economy. And we need it for work of this sort. It requires a whole host of people. And it takes the papers that I have in mind, which have been published in the journal Environment and Development Economics. It required 3-4 years of work. Very crude, obviously, but I think amazingly important and interesting because they are about stuff that really matters. Okay, You also need the size and distribution of the economy's capital assets. Why? Because the resource allocation mechanism is a mapping from the capital assets onto future consumption, the forecast that you're obtaining. And so you need to know what it is like now. And so that's number 2. And of course, you need to know your V, the functional form of V, which is your conception of social well-being. Okay? So these are the 3 things. And as I say, 1 is very, very important. Requirements 1 and 2 are the basis for estimating the changes that take place in the allocation of resources if the additional unit of the asset is made available free of charge, which is like looking at the consequences of a change. Requirement 3 is the basis for placing a value on that change. Now, this is obvious. It's trivial what I'm saying. Okay, comments on PIT. These are shadow prices of capital assets. Yes, Roger.
In case where 3 is the social optimum, okay, but you're mapping it from the...
Not social optimum. It's the form of the V function is all I need. What I need is...
He's saying suppose.
Yeah, okay, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, okay, yeah, right, okay, yeah.
Then the problem is easy. It's almost...
Oh, right.
Easy.
Oh, yeah,
It's very
yeah,
easy.
yeah.
So it's not easy because it's not a social optimum.
Oh, yes, exactly. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course. Yeah, in a competitive, fully Malenvaux economy, or
In a competitive equilibrium, it may not be easy because the competitive equilibrium has no reason to be the social optimum. It's not necessary.
No, all right. Okay, yeah, right. That social optimum, of course, it's easy because the price is out there. Just, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so PITs. It's a function of the stocks of all assets. These are sort of general equilibrium observations. Nothing big deal. You'll know, and if I'm belaboring the obvious, forgive me, but what the heck. I got it in, I may as well read it. Moreover, it depends not only on KT, today's, the date at which the assessment is being made, but on all KS for all ST, which means really the general equilibrium effect is over entire period. So PITs then over KT, T, and in other words, PIT incorporates the resource allocation maybe. It may be an explicit function of T, e.g., the point that I made earlier, if you have exogenous technological progress, you don't have, it's literally a residual in the sense that Solow made the observation. You don't have an explanation. It's just happening like manna from heaven, in which case it's almost like a drift term. The economy is drifting through, and you need to pick that up because the value of an additional unit of capital will depend on the date at which that additional unit of capital is being made available, other things being equal, etc. And, okay, if delta is large or low, the influence on today's shadow price of the future scarcity would be attenuated, stroke large, depending. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Now, I'm going to define the wealth of it, economy's wealth at T as wealth is the shadow value of its capital assets. Okay? Remember, I'm thinking of capital assets as namely types 1, 2, 3, and 4. That is reproducible capital, natural capital, human capital, and population. Okay? But what I want to suggest here now is, from now on, when I write wealth, I will think of wealth per capita. I'll be working in an environment, in a conceptual environment in which it's legitimate to translate population into a normalizing factor when describing the productive base of an economy. All right? That has problems. We'll see. Even with that, you have a problem, but we'll see. That doesn't mean that population is constant, by the way. It simply means that I can use it as a normalizing factor. So that's my definition of wealth. Question, why should we be interested in this object? Then the reason is proposition 1. A small perturbation to an economy increases, respectively, decreases social well-being, that is V. I mean V. V is social well-being, intergenerational well-being. If and only if holding shadow prices constant, it increases, respectively, decreases this wealth. I've got words in it which are just wealth. Now, holding shadow prices constant, be aware, I don't mean they're constant over time. I'm simply saying that when you make this perturbation, the P's are given, and it's the K's which are being perturbed as we go along. So when we think about the perturbation. There are 2 types, and I'll elaborate on that in a minute. Okay, so you mustn't think that I'm thinking of a steady state. We're not in a steady state, necessarily. It's like estimating national income. You hold prices constant, and then estimating changes in national income. Now, there are two types of perturbation I can think of. And these two types of perturbation are going to distinguish the two types of evaluation exercises I've been concerned with in these lectures with you. The first two lectures were perturbation at a moment in time. Let's say we're sitting at date t, and a project lands on somebody's lap. And he's asked to evaluate the project, to say whether the project is a good one or a bad one, which should be accepted or rejected. The perturbation takes place at that date. That is to say, if he says yes, the project is underway. Now, of course, it doesn't mean it's a one-period perturbation. The project has ripples all over for the future. But the decision of the perturbation is at that time. So my change is the change that is happening at date t. The second kind of perturbation, the other kind of perturbation, is the passage of time itself. So you're sitting at date t, and then you move to date t plus epsilon, and you ask, what does my v look like now as compared to what it was yesterday? If it has gone up, I say, gosh, that's good. Remember, sustainable development. Okay. If it's gone down, I say, I should be concerned. Right? So that's the two types of perturbation. And today, this lecture is about the second kind of perturbation. That is to say, we're looking at, if you like, business as usual. And we're asking, is the economy getting better or worse when judged in terms of v? Okay? That's the idea. And what this theorem is saying, and this theorem is very general. It hasn't made precise what the perturbation is. And it's telling us that actually these two separate types of exercises are essentially the same. One moving through time and you're assessing, and the other you're prescribing on the basis of a value function. So proof is absolutely dead easy. Let delta denote small perturbation. Assuming v is differentiable, we have del v's equation 7. Now you've defined del v, del kit in terms as pits. So you plug that in, and you've got your 8. And that says del v t is non-negative if and only if pit del kit sigma is non-negative. And it is in that sense the prices are holding prices constant. Okay, doesn't mean. So the object that you're estimating is wealth, and you're looking at the change in wealth per capita in this case over time. Okay, and so you can see the shift is from changes in flows, which would be the case if you use GDP or GDP per capita as your indicator by saying, oh, we're doing better now because GDP per capita grew during the last period. So it's a rate of change of a rate of change of a stock. This theorem is telling us that the right thing should be the rate of change of the stock. But of course, the right-hand side is another name for investment. So write IIT as the investment in the ith capital asset. Sorry? No, PIT? I'm sorry?
Oh, IIT. Oh, you write investment of value. Oh.
Yeah.
Shadow value.
It's shadow value. These are all shadow prices, of course.
You know,
But you call investment.
well, usually we call investment delta KI.
Yeah, that's my point.
Oh, but then I can't add them.
Well, that's summation pre I delta K.
Oh, I see. Well, yeah. Okay, put that in here.
But I would have put that.
Sorry.
The shadow value of
Shadow value. Yeah.
Investment as such is
Yeah.
delta
Yeah.
K.
Okay, fine. I'm sorry. I wish I knew economics better, but anyway. Okay. Now, this tells us many things, and I want to spend a few minutes here before I proceed any further with some numbers. I'm pretty much through, because that's, which is, it's telling us that you could have sustainable development. Del V could be positive if some of the IIs are negative, so long as there's compensating positive IIs in certain other capital assets. Okay? Now, this is sometimes misunderstood by very reasonable people who feel that this is a linear index, right? It's saying you're adding up these PI delta KITs across the I's. It's linear. And so you must be assuming substitutability between the capital assets. And that's a big mistake. The object is linear. The criterion function is linear. But we are always used to doing that. It's like taking the hyperplane and letting the hyperplane move, even though your indifference curves are curved. But the substitution possibilities or lack of will all be reflected in your PIs. So think intuitively. You're running out of a resource which is production. In fact, one of you raised the matter as to illacio of substitution. So let's say a critical input, an input which is essential in production. And you don't have to think of the world, think of a little village, because there you can easily think in terms of critical resources, which are, and it's nearing a tipping point, let's say. It hasn't quite come to the tipping point yet. And now you're getting very nervous. So at the margin, of course, you're going to value that very highly. You don't know quite when the tipping point is. So as you're approaching it, you're sort of saying, gosh, the next move may just take us into that point, which is uncertain still. So, of course, if you do it, and then things haven't collapsed, you breathe a sigh of relief and saying, oh, well, then it's probably further down, obviously. But then you would raise the distribution. So the next one is going to be more risky or worrisome. So your PI of that thing will go up. And it could go up very fast. We don't know. It will depend very much on your understanding of the workings of the microeconomy that you're studying, which is why the dynamics of socio-ecological processes, the interactions between human societies and nature, are so very important for us to study. It's in some sense a sad matter of sadness that geography became a dying subject some decades ago. And in many ways, previous generations geographers are today, very often today's ecologists. But the geographers have one thing going for them. As when I read my geography colleagues, their works over the years, they have a sort of intuitive sense of a landscape being transformed by humans and natural processes. And very often when I read ecological papers, or I get the sense there are no people there. And of course, when I read my colleagues in the economics profession, there is never any nature there. So it's a bit of a mess. And it will be nice if geography, the spirit of geography, were to come back, because these PITs depend on it. Let's put it that way. All right. So you can have, up to a point, substitution, and some of the worries that people express about resources getting depleted arises out of these issues. Okay. Okay, these are reflections on what I've already said. In fact, you might ask, what does social cost-benefit analysis do? We ask ourselves, when a project comes along, typically we say, look at the present discounted value of the flow of social profits from the project. Right? Sometimes we use the internal rate of return, but we now have enough understanding of the matter to say, well, if you've got your discount rates, you may as well or you should do the discounting and then look at the PDV. But what is a PDV of a project? PDV of a project is the perturbation, I'm going to show you in a minute, is a perturbation to the wealth of the economy. PDV, after all, is a present discounted value and therefore is a stock measure. It's not a flow measure, but it's a change in a stock. So what is the stock whose change it is? And it's given by proposition 3, equation 10. That is, over a small interval of time, tiny interval of time, del t, IT is the investment, and that includes the shadow prices, of course. Then it's the present discounted value of the perturbation to consumption that results from it, from the t to the indefinite future. But of course, the right-hand side, the material within the integrand is what? This is the perturbation to consumption. This multiplied by that is the social, what we were calling the social consumption discount factor. It's the discounted marginal utility of consumption. So we now have this sort of, in some sense, rounds up the matter. We should be concerned with the wealth of economies, not the GDP or the HDI of economies, and we also know why. It's not an arbitrary index. It's an index that comes out of welfare economics or understanding of what it is that we are after. And that this equation 10 makes clear that both assessment and prescription amount to the same thing. It's the nature of the perturbation which differs. Okay. Now, I had some things to say about global public goods. I won't, because time is getting on, and we all should be tired. I'm not, but then the lecturer never is the person who's tired. It's the recipients who get tired. So I will close up very fast. But as I say, population growth, there are theorems which tell you under conditions under which you could replace the Ks by per capita Ks. So it should be per capita. Okay. Now, I'm going to throw at you some numbers just for the hell of it. Don't trust them. Don't believe them. They're numbers. But don't believe them. You should be skeptical, but don't be any more skeptical than when you read that the GDP figure of, say, Ghana is this, or it has grown at 4%, because we tend to take those numbers seriously because they're repeated on us. I'm convinced now the more you stare at a number, the more you start believing them. It's a psychological phenomenon. This is new, so you will be skeptical, and you should be skeptical. These are terrible numbers, but what the heck? These are very first cut estimates. We thought of doing the progress of nations is taken from a couple of papers that are adapted from. I won't bother you with those. The World Bank, under the leadership of Kirk Hamilton, who works there, did some very, very interesting, bold work in the late 90s, early 20th century in trying to estimate the natural wealth of countries. And the kinds of assets that he had in mind was carbon, forestry, but only as timber. Ecosystem protection that forest covers provide are not in there. None of the ecological services are there, but still it's there. That's one. Forest cover and oil and natural gas. Education was included. I've included health as well. But anyway, here's the situation. I'm going to start with because of my particular interest, I looked at the data in Africa, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and China, starting in 1970, to 2000 period. 1970, this is before China took off. Remember, China really started taking off in 78, so it was not an absurd choice to make. If you look at the final column, that is you're looking at the period 1970 to 2000 as one unit of time, and everything is averaged across it, so it's an instantaneous. I can take the theorems from the past here and regard it as a moment in time, okay, as we very often do. So delta HDI is the change in the Human Development Index in each of these countries. I haven't given any numbers because they would be meaningless. It's a normalized figure. It's a number between 0 and 1. So it's a question, is it better or lower? It's higher in all the countries. GDP per capita grew in all the countries, barring Africa, which has a very small decline of 0.01% per year. These percentages are annual percentage rates, by the way. Okay? So what I did was TFP growth was given, again, I took that from I can't remember which publication, it was an NBER publication. I think we used the same. Yes, that's right. I think that's right. These were the figures for TFP, and what we did was to add that to the growth in the wealth per capita. And the wealth per capita now has, these are all imperfect, very, very imperfect, because the natural capital has been hugely undercounted. Ecosystem services are out. I mean, they're not there. We don't have any data on that. Also, carbon was priced at an amazingly low rate, and I didn't have the moral courage to raise it. It was, I think, $30 per ton. And today, that would be regarded as very, very overly low. I've seen figures of. So by that, what it means, it would depress the change in wealth because it's a negative price. Okay, $100 or so would be in the ballpark, or at least people who know about the matter, and as Roger does, is what would be a global average price. I don't mean now regional.
You mean the good shadow price?
Yeah,
Or,
yeah, shadow price for carbon in the as a stock.
per ton of carbon?
Yeah.
Between 100 and 400?
Yeah, they were. Okay, that's way off from what I was using here. So there is an underestimate there. On the other hand, health improvements I just did on the basis of expenditure data in the World Development Reports. And in a suboptimal world, as you can see, we should be looking at the marginal rates of substitution, not what is supplied. So there's an underestimate of the improvement in health, if you like, during this period. So there is pluses and minuses all over the place. Having said that, let me just finish. If you look at wealth per capita, then the growth rate of that is interesting. I don't know which way it works. For China, it was positive because it had a huge savings rate, by the way. So this is the first column is essentially the inclusive savings rate. But the savings rate on reproducible capital is huge. And given the prices that we're using, it swamped. And of course, China, it does not include anything like the atmospheric pollutants that all my friends in Beijing complain about. Rightly so too. I've suffered from it, and so forth. None of that is measured here. So none of that is included here. So take it for whatever it is. Wealth per capita grew in China at 3.6% a year, largely. 4.8% a year, largely due to its huge accumulation of reproducible capital. Okay, and Pakistan is the interesting case because it did rather well in GDP growth, 2.2% per year, but it turns out to be minus 1.4. The others are very near zero, so I don't know. But anyway, but the one thing that makes quite clear is that if you use some of these crude numbers, even with these crude numbers, you can see the difference different picture you paint or you observe about the progress and regress of nations. If you look at GDP per capita, they all, barring sub-Saharan Africa, look good. They were progressive economies. You would say things are getting better. But of course, that's neither here nor there. It is a very bad indicator. Let me tell you that. Don't buy it because it doesn't pick. We should be measuring wealth, and for reasons that the theorems tell us to do. Okay? I'll stop here. It's 5:15.
The amazing figure here is the total factor productivity for China.
It was very high, yeah. Yeah. A lot of unexplained stuff going on.
So what accounts for the decline in wealth in Pakistan?
Oh, I'm sorry, high population growth rate. You see the second column is high, 2.7%. And a relatively low savings rate. See, in India, higher savings rate, slightly higher savings rate, and lower population growth and more expenditure on health and education.
Human capital is growing pretty rapidly in China too.
Yeah. That's right. So that's the setup. Any questions? That was the last slide. Yes, sir.
I think there's some overlaps about the definition of human capital and population.
Sorry?
I think that there's some overlap about the population and human capital. Because I think
Human capital per capita.
yeah, more human capital because of good health, education.
But this will be human capital per capita, per person. That's the relevant indicator. That's the...
But I think that decrease the mortality of the infant and increase the longevity, so it will increase the population growth rate.
I'm not sure I followed you. Perhaps you could take... I should, because there's a point that your point raises in my mind, which is if you do health properly, as there's a paper that's just recently Professor Arrow and his collaborators published this month. Oh yes, that was in the that was one of the reading. You got it. You'll find that health absolutely dominates because there we don't look at health expenditure. We look at we use the value of statistical life on increases in life expectancy over the period of 5 years that we were studying in several countries, and it literally dominates the growth in wealth figure. I mean, of all the capital assets, that's the one which really dominates. Okay, what can one say other than give the results? It really does dominate it. Here it doesn't, because we're looking at not the benefit side of health, but we're just using the cost side to say that's the addition to the capital. The expenditure was addition to the capital, and that could be a huge underestimate. There's a lot of consumer surplus out there, which is not being picked up, I guess. Right, so this was probably your only exposure to national income accounting. But, it's something that you can't avoid in life, national income accounts, because you are always reading about them. And it is useful as economists to know why we have them and how should we recast national accounts to conform to economic theory. The history of national accounts is not something I know very much about. My suspicion is it faced a large number of urgent matters that needed to be met, which was to, in the case of the initial national income estimates, as I understand it, and I'm feeling very nervous because Professor Arrow is here, and I'm going to make a serious error. But as a first approximation, my thought is that there were 25% of the population was unemployed. There was an enormous amount of spare capacity. And it was reasonable to ask whether there was some way of trying to measure economic activity. And GDP is a damn good indicator for that. But it is an indicator of economic activity, and correspondingly, if there is some relationship with that with employment, then you're getting a picture of how to drive that up. Somehow, after the war, it got translated into a welfare measure. And we have been living in a slightly odd intellectual climate, where when we do projects, we teach our students and ourselves to do present discounted value of social profits of projects, and yet when we measure the progress or regress of nations, we look at GDP per capita growth. Now, we don't say when we look at a project, how is it going to improve the growth rate of GDP? We ask, what is its present discounted value of the net social profits? So we have been leading Jekyll and Hyde lives in the best of circumstances, and I thought I'd spend an hour and a half discussing how to put these two together into one coherent whole. In the process of doing that, you have to reject GDP. Okay?
Just one.
Yes, sir.
I don't know. There was a dimension when you go away from GDP. Okay, there was a report, the committee chaired by Joe Stiglitz and Amartya Sen in my country. And can you remember?
I was supposed to be a member.
Yes.
I contributed a number of questions.
Okay.
Your previous president, your leader, your previous leader.
The previous president. And Ken and I were members, more or less. But there was a lot of discussion on happiness, okay, because at this stage people ask people whether they're happy. Okay. And there was a lot of discussion on whether we should include happiness, the result of this survey on happiness.
Yes, indeed. You're quite right.
Very near all those that keeps emphasizes gross there.
Happiness, I know. Now, I'm very skeptical of doing that, and here's why. I mean, I think I could do it. There's nothing wrong with that, and it's nice to know that people are happy in Bhutan. In a way, they are not in here. But suppose you take the view that happiness is the end of life. That is the object of exercise, and a lot of people would do that, and why not? Then, in some sense, the happiness will be the constituent that we are after, and that will be part of the V. That is V. Or the U's are the happiness. The problem, as I see it, is that it's far too early for even if you're committed to the happiness notion, and there are good reasons to be committed to that, and saying that it's a perfectly respectable position. This is far too early to know how to translate from that to goods. Because at the end of the day, policies are going to be over the allocation of goods and services and assets. That's what we observe. Those are the things. How they translate to happiness, we haven't very much of an understanding, I guess. Although we have some.
We have this long-standing centers and Cantrell back in the late 30s, where they ask people how happy you are. And the if you take cross countries, there's almost no correlation between income. I mean, there isn't for extremes, but among leading countries with per capita income per capita income, is this working?
Yep.
2 or 3 to 1. There's no evidence. The happiness as reported doesn't differ at all. I remember once teaching the subject, and I used some Japanese data. The Japanese happiness, the mean happiness, from 1958 was the same as that in 1990. Although the GNP, one of the most astronomical increases in history, in this, and that was true in a cross section. It was positive, but the slope wasn't all that big. You know, it's true that rich people were happier than poor people, but it wasn't all that. It wasn't an enormous slope. So one of the problems was, how do you measure happiness? The question: do these numbers mean anything? I mean, it's an obvious problem to me. If you ask people on a 1 to 10 scale, you're limited by the fact it's 1 to 10.
So there, but you're quite right. There's
So why should we be interested in economic growth?
That's right. No, exactly.
That's a good question.
Remember Duesenberry's. That's right.
Everything is only relative.
But what I guess I'm suggesting here that even before you come to that, you should reject your GDP indicators.
Well, the G is look. Isn't the G wrong in any
Absolutely.
System of, there's no system of thinking.
There's no system of things where the G is right. The G has to be got rid of.
Choice should be in.
It should be
I understand the only reason for G is that depreciation figures are so unreliable. There's nothing to do
Right.
with the concepts as to measurement problems.
right. No, there can't be any resistance to NDP. But on the other hand, NDP itself won't do. It is change in wealth. Well,
You, I think, it seems to me, you have written on this subject, and that the net properly done.
No, what I said was that if net properly done gives you the upper bound on consumption for sustainability development. Because
the net savings, I'm sorry, the one number is not enough, but the net savings accompanied by.
Yep, then it's fine. Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's quite right. That's quite true. Yeah.
Actually read some recent research on this happiness, where they try to estimate this utility function parametrically using happiness data with income, and there's this sort of very well identified logarithmic form, and it only hits the upper bound of the happiness scale at like $500,000 a year or something. So it doesn't seem like it's a real concern. And I don't remember what the paper is.
There is a book by an ex-colleague of mine, former colleague of mine, Lord Layard, Richard Layard. He's very big on the happiness literature. He's Mr. Happiness. He has a book called Happiness, which came out in 2006, very influential. And the revised edition, second edition, came out, I think, in 2011, or perhaps 2010. And in it, he summarizes, it's one of those literature where there's just a heck of a lot of stuff out there. And he pulls them together. He puts them in. Whether he put them together is a more problematic thing because the data are so varying reliability and significance also. But he is of the opinion that it plateaus at about $10,000 a year or so per capita. So, and of course, being Layard, this is the great-grandson or great-grandnephew of the Layard who dug up Nineveh. So
He's an archaeologist.
yeah, he dug up Nineveh in the 19th century. So he comes from a good stock. And so one reason I admire him enormously is that, he believes something, he says so. So he said, well, no, there should be now upper floor on income. Income tax rates should be sufficiently high because all that rest is a waste. People aren't any more happy after $10,000 a year or some such figures. Oh, we'll discuss that tomorrow at the lecture. I will have some thoughts on that. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions? Well, with that degree of levity, I think we could. Thank you very much.